Hey everybody, what's going on, and welcome to Rock and Roll True Stories. And I thought this was a rather interesting piece of news because I've been covering a lot of 90s stuff on my channel. So it came out today from the New York Times that apparently Universal Music was misleading the public about what happened back in 2008. So back in 2008, there was a fire at Universal Music, or I should say Universal Studios Hollywood. And at the time, the company claimed that the blaze had destroyed the theme park's King Kong attraction and a video vault that, as they put it, only contained copies of old works. But according to an article that was published on Tuesday by the New York Times Magazine, the fire also tore through an archive housing treasured audio recordings, amounting to what the piece would describe as the biggest disaster in the history of the music business. So what exactly happened? So the fire started in the early hours of June 1st, 2008, and according to the article, overnight maintenance workers had used blowtorches to repair the roof of a building on the set of New England Street, which was a group of colonial-style buildings used in scenes for movies and television shows. So the workers followed protocol and waited for the shingles they worked on to cool, but the fire broke out soon after they left, just before 5 a.m. Now, the flames would eventually reach a building known as Building 6197, known as the Video Vault, which would house videotapes and film reels and, crucially, a library of the master sound recordings owned by Universal Music Group. So hundreds of firefighters would respond to the fire, and after trying to douse it with a foam retardant and water from a nearby lake, the emergency personnel decided to dismantle the warehouse containing the vault to more easily put out the fire. So what exactly was lost? And which bands lost some of their master recordings? So almost all of the master recordings stored in the vault were destroyed in the fire, including those produced by some of the most famous musicians since the mid-20th century. So in a confidential report in 2009, Universal Music Group had estimated that they had lost about 500,000 song titles. And the lost works mostly included masters in the Decca Records collection by Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Al Jolson, as well as Bing Crosby. And almost all of the Buddy Holly masters were lost as well. But that wasn't just the list of artists. In fact, the list of artists affected spans of decades in popular music, and it included recordings by Joan Baez, Neil Diamond, Guns N' Roses, Elton John, Nirvana, Nine Inch Nails, No Doubt, Beck, Tupac Shakur, Eminem, 50 Cent, and The Roots. So you guys are probably wondering, well, what are the master recordings and why do they even matter? So a master recording is one-of-a-kind original recording of a piece of music, and it's the source from which, vinyl records basically come from. CDs and MP3s are made. Now, according to the article that the Times published, the documents show that the vault contained masters dating back decades, including multi-track recordings on which individual instruments remain isolated from one another. So if you guys have ever played Guitar Hero or Rock Band, if you guys have ever wondered why, when you stop playing a certain instrument, that instrument drops out of the actual song, it's because those games use the master recordings. And in a lot of cases, they weren't able to get certain songs because the master recordings weren't available, or they had to do re-recordings. So the recordings within the vault came from basically some of the most important record labels of the time. So losing those master recordings is a real tragedy because according to Adam Block, who is the former president of Legacy Recordings, he said a master is the truest capture of a piece of recorded music. Sonically, masters can be stunning and capturing of an event in time. Every copy thereafter is a sonic step away. So you guys are maybe wondering, why are we finding this out now after 10 years? So at the time the fire had happened, it made news around the world, but a lot of the news tended to focus on the video recordings in the archive, and the record label did such a good job of crisis management that they basically characterized the disaster as a crisis averted because there was really nothing important in the vault, as they put it. So Jody Rosen, who was the writer of the article, described the successful effort to play down the scope of loss as a triumph of crisis management that involved officials working for Universal Music on both coasts. And those efforts were undoubtedly aimed at minimizing public embarrassment, but also some suggest that the company was particularly worried about a backlash from the artists as well as their estates whose master recordings had been destroyed. So the real extent of the loss was laid out in litigation and the company documents that were obtained by Mr. Rosen, who is a contributing writer for the magazine. So how bad was this loss for the record label? So Mr. Rosen described the loss as historic, and even Universal Music Group privately viewed what happened in bleak terms, saying, "Lost in the fire was undoubtedly a huge musical heritage," reads one 2009 internal assessment. So this isn't the first time the record labels have lost masters. In fact, if you guys had followed a lot of those video games back then, you would know that a lot of the masters just went missing, or they were in a basement somewhere, or they were in a basement that got flooded. But that wasn't the worst case. So record companies have had actually a pretty bad history with, keeping and storing master recordings, and have been known to trash them in bulk. So decades ago, employees of CBS Records reportedly took power saws to the multi-track masters to sell the reels as scrap metal, and in the 70s, RCA destroyed the masters by Elvis Presley in a broader purge. Because of that history, industry professionals have long questioned how committed major music labels are to preserving what they see as priceless artifacts. And today, most commercial recordings from the past century and beyond are controlled by really only 3 giant record companies, including Sony Music Entertainment, Warner Music Group, and of course Universal Music Group as well. So the same morning that the article actually came out, Universal Music disputed what was claimed in the New York Times article. So in response to the article recounting the 2008 fire, Universal Music put out a statement basically saying that there were numerous inaccuracies, misleading statements, contradictions, and fundamental misunderstandings of the scope of the incident and affected assets. They went on to say that music preservation is of the highest priority for us, and we are proud of our track record, the statement read. They also went on to say, while there are constraints preventing us from publicly addressing some of the details of the fire that occurred at NBC Universal Studios facility more than a decade ago, the incident, while deeply unfortunate, never affected the availability of commercially released music nor impacted artist compensation. The statement would also go on to cite the tens of thousands of back catalog recordings that have already been issued in recent years, including master quality, high-resolution audiophile versions of many recordings that the story claims were destroyed, and says that UMG invests more in music preservation and the development of high-resolution audio products than anyone else in music, listing several restoration and preservation projects. So a rep for the Times did not immediately respond to Variety's request for comment. But what's funny in Universal's statement is that they didn't really dispute the damage to the archives, which saw destruction of almost 500,000 recordings. So it looks like Variety was able to interview a source close to the actual record label at the time, who did agree that the record label wasn't upfront about the extent of the damage, but the source also took issue with the assertion that priceless recordings have been, as they quoted, lost forever. And they said the breathless tone of the article had some issues and some comments by Randy Aronson, a former UMG employee quoted in the article. So it seems like there's multiple sides talking about what had actually happened. But it makes me think, because Guns N' Roses were mentioned as one of the bands whose master recordings were lost, but it didn't specify which master recordings. Because if you guys remember, about a year ago or a year and a half ago, they put out the Appetite for Destruction reissue, and they must have had access to those master recordings because they remastered the whole album. And they had they released those demos as well from the Appetite session. So I'm kind of curious if there's going to be more news coming out of this, but I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on the matter. And let me know in the comment section which stories you'd like to see me cover in future episodes of Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.